This video goes over a number of the safety issues for the wood shop. We will start with what to wear, what not to wear, and how to wear your hair, and what jewelry you can wear. Never wear safety gloves when operating power tools, as they can get caught in the machinery. Avoid wearing loose articles of clothing and accessories such as scarves. High-heeled shoes should never be worn in the shop. Neither should open-toed shoes such as sandals or platform shoes, or even artistic things like octopus shoes. Work boots are excellent in the wood shop, along with any other flat-soled shoes that have closed toes. You don't want to expose anything of your feet to the shop environment. One thing that you must be very conscious of is loose hair and hair that might be hanging down that could get caught in a mechanism. What you must do is always tie your hair back, either in a ponytail or something like a bun or other that keeps the hair from getting into the machinery. Jewelry and any other sort of bling can cause quite a serious hazard, as it can very easily get caught into the moving blade of one of the power tools. Hearing protection and eye protection is an absolute necessity in the wood shop. There are different types of hearing protection you can use. Earbuds do not count as hearing protection. If you wear glasses, the best eye protection will fit over top. However, if you have quite large glasses, they can also function well enough to protect your eyes. If you're using hazardous materials or doing a lot of sanding, you should be wearing a mask of the appropriate type. Something that you cannot bring into the wood shop is food and drink. In particular, drink, and even more particularly on the metal tables of various tools like the bandsaw or the table saw, because what can happen is if any liquid gets onto the tables, it'll create rust spots or rust rings, which can actually impede the movement of the wood on the metal table. If the movement of the wood is interrupted, it could cause kind of lateral pressure against the blade, which could result in something like kickback or even the blade snapping. You must be extremely careful using any wood that has nails, screws, or any other metal in it. This can cause serious injury or damage to the tools. Before using any power tool, make sure that you clean up around it, sweeping up all the sawdust and debris from both the floor and the tool itself, as sawdust or other debris can cause tripping or slipping. It is important to know where every on and off button is and how to turn off every power tool. It's good to practice this a few times before you start. And here you'll see the on button and the off button. Never ever under any circumstances leave a tool running unattended. You must always turn it off before you leave. Whenever making any adjustments on the power tools, you must turn off the power and leave it off until you've finished. To adjust the fence on the table saw, pull the lever up to move it and push it down to lock it. To change the vertical angle on the miter saw, pull the lever up and then push down to tighten. On the radial arm saw, turn the crank to raise and lower the blade. It's important that you always retighten the guides and the guards before operating the machinery, as they may shift during operation, which could cause accidents. The next section is on hand placement in regards to use of tools. With each tool, make a note of where the pathway of the blade is. This is the area in front of the blade of each tool where the cutting will take place and where the most danger is in regards to injuring your hands or any other limb that would be in front of the blade. The red areas indicate where you should not be putting your hands when the power is on. The locations where you should not be placing your hands. If the wood you are using is too small for you to comfortably work outside of the red areas, then you might consider using a different tool or clamping the wood down. There are a few fundamental guidelines that are similar across all tools as to how you should place your hands. As much as possible, you want to keep your hands straight out in front of yourself when you're pushing wood through a blade. Hand visibility is another important aspect when you are using the power tools. It is important that you can see both of your hands at all time, and at no point should any of your hands be obscured by any of the mechanisms. One of the essential principles of woodworking is that you can always see the point where the blade touches the wood and cuts into it. Never lose sight of this point. Whenever working on a power tool, it's important to remember to never cross your hands while you are operating the tool. There are two problems with doing this. One is that it obscures your vision of the blade and where it cuts through the wood. And the second is that you would put your arms or your hand in the pathway of the blade. On the bandsaw, here is where you find the on button and the off button. To turn the bandsaw on, you first need to pull out the red button. That is for a safety precaution so you don't accidentally turn it on. That's how you turn it on. Before cutting, you need to lower the safety guard until it's about 1/8 of an inch above the wood. First, loosen the knob there, turning counterclockwise, and then lower the guard until it's about 1/8 of an inch above the wood. And then tighten the knob before you actually start cutting again, so that it doesn't move. And that way you don't have any exposed blade when you start cutting the wood. So your hand should be straight out in front of you and on either side of the wood. Always keep this pathway here clear, as you always want to be able to see the exact point where the blade cuts into the wood. One of the best aspects about bandsaw is that you can cut curves with it. And you can see this curve I've drawn here, but if the curve is too tight, it might bind the blade and it could actually snap. And this bandsaw has a fairly wide blade. So one thing that you need to do when you're cutting around a fairly tight curve is that you have to cut these relief cuts that you'll see radiating out of the curve itself. So we're going to cut these relief cuts and then we will cut around the curve, and you can see why the relief cuts are there. You will see that as I start cutting and when my hand gets too close to the blade, I will shift my hand position around and my body around to take it away from the blade. You can cut on either side of the blade depending on what's more comfortable for you, but on one side there is a little bit more room. But sometimes you have to shift your position just to accommodate the curve. So you can see those little blocks of wood have come out, and that allows the blade to work more freely around the curve. Now, one thing that you have to make sure before you remove those little blocks, that you absolutely turn the blade off first. When I cut out the additional pieces, you will see that I shift my body around so that I can always keep my hands in front of me while I'm working, and keep my hands out of the pathway of the blade. And remember once more to turn off the power before removing any of those little blocks of wood. Now we can sand off that piece of wood we just cut. Here are the two sanders. Here is the disc, and this is the belt sander. Whenever using the disc sander, you want to make sure that you're always sanding on the downside of the rotation. If you're not certain of the rotation, just turn it on very briefly, then turn it off, and that will show you the rotation of the sander. So you will see that this disc spins counterclockwise, so always do your sanding on that side of the disc. If you sand on the other side, it might flip up and actually smack you in the face. On the disc sander, you always use two hands on the piece of wood, and the wood always needs to be flat on the table. As I mentioned earlier, you never use work gloves when working on tools, and particularly with the disc sander, as the glove can get caught in the gap between the sander and the table. If this happens, it will sand away the glove fingertips, taking a lot of your fingers with it. Another big risk item with the sander is long hair and loose articles of clothing that very easily get caught up in the sanding disc and the belt sander. One of the primary risks of using the disc sander is dust. So if you're using this sander for any period of time, it's a good idea to wear an appropriate dust mask. Other than that, the sanders are quite easy to use, and the main thing is don't get your knuckles too close to the disc itself or you'll skin some of them off. When using the disc sander and you turn it off, it tends to spin for quite a while, so it's important not to leave the vicinity until it actually stops, or you could use your piece of wood to slow down the disc until it has stopped. The operation of the belt sander is pretty well the same as the disc sander in that the wood should always be flat on the table, and use both hands while you are operating the mechanism. Here is the miter saw used for cross-cutting smaller pieces of wood, and is particularly useful for cutting angles when you're making frames or something like that. Here is the compound miter saw, and it's called the compound miter saw because you can cut angles in two different ways. The first angle would be a horizontal cut angle, which you achieve by loosening the handle and shifting over the blade mechanism and then tightening the handle again. The second angle is the vertical angle or miter with the mechanism at the back, and you can combine these two angles to create the compound miter. And here you can see the lever from a different angle where you actually change the vertical miter. You just press the lever down to open it and pull it back up to tighten it. Cross-cutting with a miter saw is actually quite easy. For this operation, you hold the wood against the fence and the table about minimum 5 inches from the blade, and you do the cutting motion with your right hand. You need to press the black button on the saw before pulling the trigger. When doing a standard angle cut on the miter saw, the one thing that you want to do is angle the blade mechanism away from your hand, pushing it to the right. When you do a miter cut with the blade angled towards the left, it does not leave enough room for your hand to safely cut. So when you have the correct angle, make sure you tighten the mechanism into place, and you'll see that you have a nice clear view of your hand and the point where the saw will enter the wood. When you're ready to cut, once again, hold the wood firmly against the fence and the table with your left hand, watching where the blade will enter the wood, and then cut. If you do need to do your miter cut with the blade angled towards the left, what you do is you simply clamp the wood into place. And we have clamps that are handy for that, and they're quite effective. Make sure it's tight. When you want to cut a compound miter with the two angles in it, even if the blade is angled away from where you are putting your hand, you still want to clamp it into place. And it's because of the vertical angle, it can actually pull your hand towards the blade when you're cutting. So to be secure, it's best if you just clamp it into place. Also, if it shifts a little bit while you're cutting, you could ruin your cut, as it would not be a clean angle or a clean miter cut. With the wood firmly clamped into place, you are ready to cut. And there you can see what a nice compound miter angled cut looks like. One thing that you should never do is cut on the miter saw holding the wood to the right of the blade. The primary problem cutting left-handed with your right hand holding the wood is that when the saw mechanism moves downwards, you lose sight of your right hand, and that's one thing you can never do. And along with losing sight of your right hand, you also might obscure being able to see the point where the saw blade will actually cut across the wood. So you've lost sight of two important factors in any operation on any of the power tool. Occasionally, particularly when cutting angles, you will need to cut on the right side of the blade. And in that case, what you must do is clamp the wood into place and not having to put your hand there when cutting the wood. Once it's clamped in place, you will still cut with your right hand, and you will still be able to see the point where the blade cuts across the wood. One thing that you always want to be really sure about when cutting with the miter saw is that your wood is flat against the table and flat against the fence. So you need to be particularly careful for any wood that is not straight or has irregularities in it. You have to make sure that there are no gaps or spaces between the wood and the table or the back fence at the point where the blade is going to cut across the wood. If you cut where there is a gap, when the wood collapses down, it may pinch against the blade and probably kick back against you. Sometimes when the wood pinches against the blade, it may pull the piece of wood right out of your hands and draw your hand into the pathway of the blade. So you need to find a point on the wood where it'll press both against the table and the fence with no pinching. If you cannot find any point such as this, then you must resort to using a hand saw. When cutting a piece of wood like this, I would always suggest that you use a hand saw, as it would only take about a minute. This is the radial arm saw, one of the bigger, more powerful tools used for cross-cutting larger pieces of wood and cutting also at angles. Before starting the radial arm saw, the very first thing that you must do is to pull on the blade carriage back and forth to see if the blade is touching the wood and turning or rolling or not. So if you pull back on the handle and you see that the blade is rolling or spinning like that, it means that it is touching the wood, which creates a dangerous situation because if you turn it on, the blade could easily catch the wood and jump back at you. So what you need to do is take this crank and turn it clockwise to raise the blade. The blade still needs to be low enough so that it cuts all the way through the wood, but that it doesn't catch when you turn it on. When cutting the wood, you have to make sure that the wood is flat on the table and you push it against the fence with your left hand, at least 5 inches from the blade path. And before you turn the motor on, make sure that you grip the handle very tight so that the motor and blade mechanism doesn't jump back when you turn it on. And you cannot leave the station until the blade has stopped spinning because sometimes people may not notice that it is on. Very much like the compound miter saw, you should not cut holding the wood to the right of the blade. One of the problems again is that you might obscure your vision of where the blade meets the wood. You might also lose sight of your right hand, or if your hand is close enough, you might injure yourself from the mechanism or in fact the blade. Here is your table saw, and here you see the power switch, the on-off switch. You can see the on-off switch is the nice big red paddle that you can easily access for turning the equipment off. Here is the guard that is over the blade. Here is the fence, and here are the 2 wheels for raising and lowering the blade and changing the angle of the blade. Here you can see the blade with the guard raised and the splitter that keeps the wood in line when you're cutting through it. Now, the guard and the splitter should always be in place with the guard down covering the blade unless you are cutting a groove in the wood. And here you can see an operation such as that, cutting a dado groove. And the height of the blade should always be about 1/4 of an inch above the top of the wood that you're cutting. Let's get to cutting a piece of plywood on the table saw. Hand placement is extremely important on this tool and the way you actually push the wood through. Your right hand pushes the wood through with your thumb pushing from the bottom edge of the plywood. Your left hand is primarily for pushing the wood against the fence, again with your thumb at the bottom edge of the plywood. You should not push the wood through by putting your hands on top of the wood and pushing through, as they can very easily slip. Once again, both hands should be pushing from the bottom edge of the plywood with your thumbs against the bottom edge. When you are cutting through a piece of wood such as this, you have to make sure that your right hand has enough clearance that it will stay a minimum 5 inches from the saw blade. If you have enough room, it's safer to use your hand than the push stick because you have more control. When you are cutting, push the wood all the way through so it is cut completely, and then turn off the saw before you remove any of the wood. Now you can remove any of the wood once the saw blade has stopped moving. If you find that your arms are not long enough or you cannot reach to be able to push the wood all the way through, then you may use the push stick for the final few inches. When you only need to cut a thin strip of wood off the plywood, it's better to move the fence closer to the saw blade so you have more room with your left hand to control the wood when pushing it through. Generally, when using the table saw, it's better to position your body to the left of the blade, as it's between the blade and the fence where the kickback can occur, and it's best to stay out of that location. So if the space between the fence and the saw blade is too narrow to be able to push the wood safely through, you use a push stick to push it through, and always make sure your push stick is very handy as you are ready to cut. When you are ready to grab the push stick, you must make sure that you stop pushing the wood as you reach over to get it, and then you can start pushing once the push stick is safely in place. One thing you must never do is use two push sticks to push the wood through the saw blade. With two push sticks, you don't have enough control over the movement of the wood, so always use one hand and one push stick. So when your hand begins to approach the blade and one end has already gone to the splitter, you can let go with the left hand, as the splitter will hold the wood close to the fence. One operation that you can do with the table saw is to do cross cuts. And a cross cut is when you cut across a piece of wood. But there is one thing that you must never do when you are doing a cross cut with the table saw. What you cannot do is use the miter gauge, which you use to do a cross cut, in conjunction with the fence at the same time. Having the lateral and the forward movement against the piece of wood would cause it to turn, and it would push actually against the saw blade, causing kickback, and it might spin back and actually hit you in the face. So you always have to make sure that there will be a gap between the end of the wood and the fence. You can also cut angles with the table saw by adjusting the miter gauge, and it's probably better to use the miter saw to actually cut these angles, but if you can only afford to have one tool, the table saw is the best one because you can do so many different operations with it. When cutting any piece of wood, it's always best to have your body to the left of the blade, as if there's ever any kickback, it won't actually hit you as it comes out. When using the miter gauge, you will use your right hand to push the wood against the miter gauge and the left hand to push the miter gauge forward. As always, make sure you turn off the motor before you remove the pieces of wood. And there you have a cross cut with an angle on it. This is the panel saw used for cutting wood such as plywood or MDF, and it is one of the safest tools you can use. It is used for cutting larger panels. Here is the on-off switch of the panel saw. Before you start cutting with the panel saw, you have to make sure that that power cord goes over your arm so that your arm doesn't get caught up in it when you use the saw. In terms of safety, the main thing you have to make sure of is that you do not put your left hand between those vertical bars while using this mechanism. You need to make sure that the panel of wood is resting on at least 3 of the red rollers at the base of the panel saw. If the wood is not wide enough, then just use the table saw. With the panel saw, you do the cutting action with your right hand, holding on to the wood with your left hand if necessary. and follow through until the wood is cut all of the way.